Our first speaker today is Tony Lauro. And Tony is a senior enterprise security architect for Akamai Technologies. With over 15 years of information security industry experience, he works with Akamai clients to provide security guidance, architectural design, recommendations and analysis, security strategy, as well as provide web application security expertise to help secure enterprise resources. Tony has worked in many verticals, including finance, medical, healthcare, enterprise, and mobile applications. Tony studied computer science at Calhoun College and law at Texas Tech. He is currently responsible for engagement across all of Akamai's client base, as well as training of internal groups at Akamai, whose focus is on application and web security disciplines. Please help me welcome Tony Lauro.
All right. Can everyone hear me? All right. Our first hecklers. All right, so this first slide is basically everything he just said, and I thought, I actually just realized I'm wearing the exact same outfit. So this was taken in Spain though, so I guess I'm far enough away from that. But yeah, so I lead an internal team at Akamai that focuses on web application security, WAF analysis, and cyber resiliency. So one of the things that I'm going to be touching really heavily upon today is nothing about what Akamai does, although some of that may bleed through, but really just looking at what the threats are, what we're seeing from kind of a global perspective. So I was looking for a really good quote. I wanted to find something that really resonated. So I found this one. There are no rules for architecture for castles in the clouds. I thought to myself, this guy Gilbert Chesterton, he really gets this, right? You look at cloud architecture, there's software as a service, application as a service, everything as a service, right? But then you kind of take a step back and you see outages happening at these large cloud providers, and you realize one thing. One, that Gilbert was actually born in 1834, so this meant nothing to do with actual cloud architecture. And two, that the cloud services you typically look at, they have the same problem set that you have, right? How much bandwidth comes into the data center? How are those devices built for resiliency when it comes to DDoS attack or large-scale attacks? So we'll look at some of the different things we've seen over the past few years. One of the first ones we'll start with, going back to 2013, is account checker attacks. So these are basically, this was a group out of Vietnam that compromised a huge username and password database. They took these credentials and they put them into an account checker app, and the goal was they're going to go against, in this case, a couple of e-commerce sites and basically check those credentials to see if anyone is reusing passwords from this other database that they dumped, right? So this is a big problem, and this is the kind of thing that really is a coordinated effort. So when we talk about ISSA and information sharing, we want to get organizations to the point where sharing becomes automatic, right? So we all talk about getting threat feeds and this and that, and the real-time information sharing is a huge piece of the puzzle when it comes to doing correlation against large base attacks such as this. Another big attack that happened this time of the year in 2013 was Operation Ababil. So the typical DDoS attack before this time was using, like home computer systems, right? With Operation Ababil, this consisted of a few 100,000 servers that made up what's called the Brobot bot network. And the Brobot bot network was compromised servers that existed in cloud hosting facilities, right? So Rackspace or Amazon, a bunch were in Amazon in this particular instance. But we saw DDoS attacks upwards of 190 gigabits per second coming into single instance infrastructures. So hitting origin IP addresses, or hitting a website directly by CNAME. Kind of move on, and you'll see a lot of the same type of activity, right? The idea is that there's a lot of different ways to cause a problem. You know, the special agent was talking about hacktivism and how that kind of plays out. It's kind of the equivalent of pulling the fire alarm. In fact, in the public sector, we see a lot of the online learning initiatives being disrupted because people are basically DDoSing the websites that host these training material. So pulling the fire alarm, getting out of a test, this is kind of the new modern way, which is launching a DDoS attack. But we saw lots of different types of attacks, including remote file inclusion. Shell shock was a big one, obviously. Command injection of pretty much any Linux-based system that was vulnerable to this. And it really represented a big shift, along with Heartbleed, which is not on here. How do you guys respond to a vulnerability that basically affects every single system, right? Or everything that you have deployed? That was a pretty big case. And those of you who kind of work through patching all that, you can probably attest. Then we have other booters and SSDP, which is part of the universal plug-and-play vulnerabilities. But the basic upward trend is that attacks continue to grow. We look at kind of the top 10 target countries, and this is kind of no surprise, right? The US has a lot of critical assets, a lot of commerce-based assets that exist within our IP space, right? So the attackers are coming in, launching attacks against those systems. Now, what's more surprising is when you look at the source countries. I mentioned that a lot of these botnets and a lot of compromised hosts that are not just doing botnet attacks, right, like DDoS, they're doing coordinated, spread out across hundreds of thousands of systems, very systematic SQL injection attempts, remote file inclusion, things that are really looking at spreading the attack vector across multiple hosts to stay under the radar. And the United States, obviously, this is just Q1 of 2015. Q2 actually saw China kick up quite a bit, and that's no surprise as well. There's attacking hosts that exist all over the world, and when we look at amplification attacks, specifically, we'll see some cases where these attacks come from wherever these devices live. So if you have a bunch of vulnerable routers that are being used for SSDP amplification, that's where the attacks are going to come from. So I mentioned the old school model for launching a DDoS attack is basically compromising like my grandmother's home computer, right? She's got like a 20-year-old HP desktop. The fan is filled with cat hair. She doesn't even have a cat, which I find even more interesting. But you know, she's also on AOL dial-up, right? So that's not that much bandwidth to launch an attack. So the new breed of attacks are using cloud-hosted servers. Well, the attackers are now realizing, listen, if people are patching and doing their due diligence, what is always going to exist are default settings on network equipment, right? So you look at things like NTP, Network Time Protocol, Chargen, DNS, SNMP, all these services have a certain return on investment. So if I send a request to an NTP server, it's going to give me back 500 times the amount of data I requested, right? Or the size of the packet. So this means, from an attack vector perspective, you can launch an attack, and you won't be seeing, if you guys are doing network monitoring and whatnot, you're not going to see a top talker IP address. You're going to see a couple little requests go out, and all of a sudden, all this flood traffic comes back in. And that's if you can even see the first data stream. So the new model is really looking at kind of the commoditization of this attack activity. So those were some booters and stressors. Here's password cracking, CAPTCHA cracking services. All of this exists online, which really kind of takes the barrier to entry. You don't have to be, I call this the Home Depot method, right? You can do this, we can help. Is that their slogan? I think so. Basically, these services exist online, and you basically, for $6 a month, right, less than a cup of coffee a day, you can launch an attack. So if you're fired from your job and you want to get back at your company, you just DDoS them. And it's coming from servers across, I'm not suggesting you do this, of course. But they're coming from servers that exist all over the world in parts of the country or parts of the world that don't have laws against computer fraud and abuse, right? So we see infrastructure attacks, and if you guys are familiar with how distributed denial of service attacks happen, it's a whole bunch of systems talking to a few systems, right? Those systems being your inline devices, like your internet pipe. How much traffic can you actually withstand before the pipe falls over and you no longer have room for legitimate traffic? Your firewall devices. If you're doing inspection and you're turning on all these different modules to do inspection on a lot of different bases, between your firewall and your IPS, or if you have an on-prem web application firewall, how many millions of packets per second can those devices take before they fall over and fail? What's interesting about this is there a laser pointer on this thing? Oh, there's not. I just broke it. All right, so the interesting thing is when DDoS attacks occur, we actually see application layer traffic being layered in, right? So you kind of create this fog of war. Your incident response teams and your networking teams are looking for top talkers. They're playing whack-a-mole. All the while, there's just a few requests coming in doing application layer attacks. It's a great way to kind of hide within the noise, right? So we ask ourselves, what motivates the threat actor, right? There's a lot of different reasons, and the FBI special agent talked about some of them. Hacktivism, competing companies. We see this a lot in travel and hospitality, where sites will be scraped to see what their prices are and their availability are of their rooms for sale or their flights, so that that competitor can take those responses and make their prices and their availability accordingly to that. Right, so we see some defenses where people actually pass scraping traffic to a back-end database that has inflated prices for their rooms. Thought that was kind of clever. But the main cause of all this, and this is from Krebs.com, is that a website used to be just kind of a brochure, right? It said, here's who we are, here's what we do, call me or fax me, right? Because that's the best way to get a hold of somebody back then. But websites now are complex web applications that exist within the website that allow you to do things like track user engagement, look at customized settings for each user, all ad injection and all the different revenue generating purposes. And all of that customizable options that exist for the user's benefit, so to speak, that's the target, right? That lives on the back end. If you're a banking app, the target would be financial account numbers, might be the process of transferring money, etc. So the attackers know where this is, and they're very good at finding this stuff. So are we prepared? We see a lot of kind of big name companies that for the most part, you would kind of assume, hey, this is a large corporation. They know what they're doing. It turns out that cyber resiliency and web application security are totally devoid from traditional network security practices. And a lot of the organizations that I talk to, I work across all the verticals, including public sector, they say, yeah, we've got firewalls or we've got an IDS. Right? So if you're looking at things that take place beyond your inbound router, there's kind of no visibility into that. So right, when you look out to the internet, you only see traffic that comes to you. You have no visibility of what's going on across the web, and that's part of the problem. The other part of the problem is there's no application security specialization. So when you talk about maybe a career path, if you guys are looking at Cisco certifications, things like that, by all means, get those. But web application security specialization is basically devoid within the industry. That's a void that needs to be filled. And there's no vertical that's basically immune to data breach, right, and to hacking. These are just a few cases, really big cases, and most of these are labeled by the number of records that were breached. The cost of a credit card number, the value of a credit card number, if I steal it, is $1 on the internet. So the attackers aren't looking at identifying the person in the audience that looks like they have the most money. They're looking at getting the most amount of records because they sell those. They just sell the numbers. It's not even about getting access to that account per se, right? That's what the money muling process is all about. It's I've compromised the database. I have all these numbers. I'm going to sell them for Bitcoin, then I'm going to take Bitcoin and transfer them to another currency, and then I'm going to take that currency and ship it across borders, right? In all of 2014, the top 3 attack vectors were application-based. This is another clear indicator. If you look at the number of attacks or the traffic of attacks, DDoS obviously still reigns supreme, but application-based attacks are the most prevalent as far as their impact. So we talked about login abuse. Account checking is a big deal right now in the industry. And a lot of your favorite e-commerce portals, as well as reward portals, are being attacked right now, right? We see people emptying out account information or transferring it or whatever the case may be. But what's interesting is that the fuel for this is previously compromised accounts. And if you look on the internet, you'll find that there's hundreds of thousands and millions of accounts that have already been compromised. And assuming that those people don't know that they've been breached already, they can still reuse those credentials against someone else. This is Dumpmon. Dumpmon is basically a bot that runs and looks at data dumps and categorizes them and then spits it out to Twitter. If you guys are doing any kind of threat intelligence for your organizations, you should be monitoring this and other bots that do this and look for maybe accounts that you guys own that might be compromising to your environment. Also any types of shared service accounts, right? We used to have the ability to say, okay, if Jill Smith starts in my company, I have jsmith at Akamai.com. Well, when John Smith starts at the company, we have another unique ID, jsmith2 at Akamai.com. But what we see more and more is that all the usernames are being standardized and shared authentication based on email address. So now if you see Tony Lauro at Akamai.com, and just let's pretend that's a personal email, but it probably wouldn't be hard to guess my personal emails. You basically take that same email address and you try it with a bunch of passwords, and guess what? You might get a hit, right? If I reuse credentials or if they're easily guessable passwords. So what are some of the defensive techniques, right? So this is basically what we see in the industry and how we see some of them work and some of them fail. And I'm not going to be biased too much, but this is Bodiam Castle. This is the old way to defend against attacks, right? This was built in 1385 to defend against the French during the 100-Year War. What do you notice about this picture? Besides the fact that I kind of went crazy with the reflective fonts. So we'll take a look at this castle from the front. You see it's surrounded by water, right? And typically what you have is a land bridge or a drawbridge, and this is called a choke point. Unless you're being attacked by like mermaids or Aquaman and his family, this is probably a pretty safe model for security, right? But what we see is how do you take in sheep. I'll get with my sheep theme since that was the title of the talk. I'm actually glad they renamed it because every single talk has cyber in it. This was a drinking game, we'd all be wasted. But the choke point represents the security model that says when I take inbound requests, this is your data center paradigm, I have a narrow scope for me to focus in and identify good, bad, or otherwise. If I'm taking a shipment of sheep from the outlining farms, they're coming into the castle because we're taking all the wool, how do I have those people come in while I'm under attack? Right? So how do you legitimize your good services for your users while your data center pipe is under duress? Right? So this acts as a gateway, but the defensive ability to block attacks and to even see what's going on really becomes narrowed, right? So you have the whole potential capacity of the internet, hundreds of millions, of devices, all these. We'll just say with the water theme, you have like 100,000 hoses coming down into two hoses, right? Your two ISPs coming into your data center. And you might be doing best practices, having different ISPs, they're coming in on a different last mile, they're hitting different demarcs within the environment, dedicated paths all the way back in, but you still have the problem of exhaustion of these resources. So we look at kind of the common approach for web security. The first one is typically kind of deny the problem. We say, okay, I have a firewall. A firewall says a user can only come in on port 80 and 443 to my web server. Well, Are you looking at the application requests? As they come into your web server, how do you identify that they're not bypassing business logic, taking advantage of session fixation or doing directory harvesting or scraping? How do you know if all you see is the TCP port 80 or 443, right? The next thing, and I forget who this guy is, I wanted to say MacGyver, but I don't think he ever built castles. I know it's not LeVar Burton from Reading Rainbow, but so you build it or you buy it, right? So you say, you know what? It looks great when people come into our data center and we have the glass wall and there's all these blinky lights. It like looks so cool. And some are like neon blue, some are neon green, some even have like an LED strip going down the side that flashes every time a packet's received. The people who have, the propensity to have seizures don't like that very much. That's obviously an issue. But these things are really building the environment to withstand against a potential impact that the internet might have. So you can never build enough to take that inbound traffic. So do nothing looks like this. We don't want to do this. Let's talk about the three big main ways that we look at this. So on-premise hardware, the next biggest partner you have is probably your ISP, or you look at a cloud service provider. So some of the problems with the on-premise hardware we already talked about, right? There's a bandwidth constraint. So how much traffic can you ingest? So just say it's Super Bowl Sunday, your company put an ad on the internet or on TV that costs $1 million and some dollars, and now everybody's like, I want to buy that product, and they come in, and your traffic spikes up to 50%, 60% of your normal traffic load, over your normal traffic load. Well, while that's happening, there's other people saying, hey, I hate that company, right? If you drive a Volkswagen, there's probably a lot of people ticked off about the little scandal they're having, right? So this bandwidth constraint causes performance degradation, one. So when you get an increase of good traffic or bad traffic, how do you adjust for that? There's organizations that I talk to that are literally building out their environment just to handle bad requests. They don't know if they're good or bad. They just know that they have this much traffic and they have to respond to it, so they're building out their environment for that type of traffic. The other piece is reliability. So devices fail. Routers only have so much memory. Networking equipment can only handle so many millions of packets per second. And if you guys are looking at the application layer and you have a WAF in line here, you're going to see some problems with accuracy, right? So if you're the person standing up a WAF policy, you've probably felt like Wesley here on the table inside of the dungeon of, what's it called? The dungeon of insanity or something? I forget. So your boss says, hey, how did this breach occur? We have a WAF. We deployed a WAF. We're doing our due diligence. We're PCI compliant, right? And then Wesley says, oh, by the way, I put the WAF on a span port because I didn't trust the accuracy of the rule set and I didn't want to accidentally block good traffic, right? This is a very nerdy joke. And I'm glad no one laughed because I deserve this. Anyway, so we look at the next model, which is the internet service provider. There's a couple different things here that come into play. One is you typically only get kind of DDoS protection, right? So your internet service provider will say, if we see something that looks majorly abusive, we'll block it for you. You're welcome. One of the problems we see here is what's called upstream indiscriminate blacklisting, which is the problem that basically occurs when a distributed denial of service attack comes from all over the world, right? So it's not just coming from Texas, right? So all the other ISPs, as the attack traffic starts to go through BGP and it's routing into the global crossing ISPs, those upstream ISPs say, listen, I know that this is bad traffic because it's definitely anomalous to what I normally see, and I don't want to degrade the service of my customers, so I'm going to start blocking that. Even before your ISP sees it and they can do anything, they start blacklisting it. And they're not going to do it, with extreme accuracy like you would hope for, right? They're going to block good and bad traffic, whatever it takes to get that problem to go away. Also, most ISPs can only protect the circuit they provide to you. So if you're a data center provider, or if you have lots of different circuits, you have to have a separate engagement process with each of those providers. And that can be costly. So a DDoS attack looks like this, right? So you are these 300 soldiers, but only a few of you got a shield. So you're standing behind the shield and you see this inbound request, right? And all of this is coming in and you're hiding behind your shield. Well, the people who didn't get a shield, they're collateral damage. And we see this when data centers are attacked. They're going for the, the crown jewels. I said family jewels to a customer one time. They're like, excuse me? Crown jewels. So they're trying to attack the crown jewels, and everybody else within that, that data center, they have problems because they don't have the same protection, right? And they're using shared resources. So this is basically the model that the attackers try to exploit. You can't possibly build enough defenses to handle the potential impact that the internet can send at you. So the model we talk about is taking the shield and moving it closer to where the archers are. So when they pull back the bow and release the arrow, there's a shield right there to block. That's called distributed computing, right? You take a geographic approach to the problem. The last piece is looking at cloud service providers. And there's a lot of them out there. Some do good work, some do not. I'm not going to lie to you. But we typically see a few different issues, right? So these aren't necessarily enterprise class services, right? If you're building off of a data center model, even if you have like 2 or 3 of them around the country or around the world, you still have the problem that those inbound requests can overwhelm those services. And when you see attacks 190 gigabits per second, if you guys saw in the news 2 days ago, the XOR botnet, this is basically a Linux Trojan that's jumping around to Linux servers, compromising them to be used for botnet services. And we see there's a lot of different shades of this. There's been a Perl IRC chat client botnet DDoS server that's been going around that basically not only do they compromise your server and use it for DDoS attacks at will, but they have their IRC chat hosts, chat server running on it as well. And you even see a list of all the different handles that are allowed to join. It's pretty funny. I mean, it's horrible. But this, you look at kind of the problem here, right? So some cloud service providers, they don't have acceptable use policies. So here's a particular case that happened this year. ISIS was hosting propaganda material, and of course they want it to be highly available and content distributed, so they have it on a cloud service provider, right? Well, guess what? Anonymous was like, I'm going to take you down. You guys are the scum of the earth. Sorry if there's any ISIS people in here. I don't mean to offend you. So Anonymous attacked ISIS. Well, guess what? Anonymous wants highly distributed access to their payload. So all their attack payloads, if you have those hosted on one server and you have 100,000 devices coming back calling for that exploit, it's going to fall over, right? So they use the same cloud hosting provider, and guess what? They attacked themselves, and the whole data center went offline. In this particular case, it was in San Jose, California. So this is kind of a problem that we see as well. So we talk about multi-perimeter defense. The castle architects knew that you had to distribute that perimeter in order to properly defend. So they would build, these are called curtain walls, and they basically existed outside of the castle boundary. In fact, this is Hayden's Wall in Scotland. And this was built by the Roman Empire, and it's literally in the middle of nowhere, right? Unless someone's from Scotland. Again, I'm so offensive today. So this is a wall that exists in the middle of nowhere. Now, this isn't going to stop an army, but it's going to slow them down. It creates a perimeter that you can do other things. Maybe you have some guard posts where you can now start, sniping the bad guys. And then maybe you have an owl that has a little message on his foot. I don't know how they did it back then, but you fly it back to the castle, and you tell the castle, listen, there's an army, this is how many people we counted, this is how many trebuchets they're bringing along with them. Let's figure out our defense, right? So you're taking the blocking process and you're moving it closer to where the attacks begin, instead of taking all the good and bad traffic into your environment before you simply just say no, right? Because they're still using those resources. So for internet-facing applications, there's 3 extended perimeters you want to think about creating. So the first is around DNS. A lot of us take this for granted. There's a lot of great DNS service providers out there. But if DNS is down, your website might as well be offline. Certainly no one's going to type in the IP address of your website, right? The other piece is the web application itself. Is the website online? Is it responding to requests? Do you trust the integrity of those requests and the responses? And then the third piece is the origin infrastructure. I talked about the model where you're protecting the crown jewels, but the data center that supports all of that is vulnerable many times, right? Either vulnerable to a volumetric attack, or vulnerable because the other servers, and those of you that do pen testing, you probably find this all the time, there's other lower cost servers that are just not paid attention to, right? You compromise those, and now you have a pivot point to start doing more exploitation against the actual host you're looking for. So this extended perimeter, there's a few best practices, and they're in different categories. So one is volumetric protection. So when you look at the number of inbound requests, do you have a way to rate limit those? Do you have a way to defend against that volume in a distributed manner? So instead of taking all the good and bad traffic into your data center before you just say no, can you say no earlier on in the process? Maybe upstream with your ISP, or maybe out on the web with a cloud solution, right? Attacks against CNAMEs. So this is important. When you guys are looking at cloud hosting solutions, they all work off of DNS, right? That's how you get this distributed response and the distributed basically pointing of a user request to a server that that cloud provider has. If the attacks are against DNS, you have to do the same type thing. So you want to validate, do protocol validation. If it's not an RFC compliant request, why even send it back to your web environment? If you're using a cloud-based reverse proxy, make sure there's the ability to, one, decrypt SSL very fast without degrading the performance of the request. Do validation against the protocol. If it's missing a user agent or an accept header, and you know that no valid web request would be missing those two things, why even send it back onto the backend environment? As well as doing network blocks and network layer controls like geo-blocking and blacklisting, you can do that out in the cloud as well. The other piece here is the attacks against data center IP. So we talk about, well, how are people going to know where my data center is located? Well, guess what? That's really easy to find out. So the attackers will look at things like your SMTP server, right? Your mail server, which is impossible to hide unless you don't want to receive mail. If that lives within your data center, now they have an IP address, or they'll trace route to that IP and look at any piece of networking equipment that is inbound, right? Anything that's inline into your data center is a target. The other categories are application layer attacks. So we talked about web application firewalls. If you guys aren't looking at the application request and looking at the user agent, all the header values, the query strings, these are the ways that the attackers are basically bypassing the business logic of the way the application is supposed to work and making it do things that you never wanted it to do, right? Obviously a huge popular one, if you look at the OWASP top 10, SQL injection and cross-site scripting have been like at the top for forever, right? Why? Because those are impossible to fix? No, absolutely not. It's because the developers don't know security well enough. The security people don't know how the application works and the development process well enough to be able to advise on what to do. And then operations and security are always fighting because the operations team says, hey, here's what I want to do. And security says, no, we have a policy against that, right? So security teams end up being seen as like the roadblockers, and we don't want to be there. And then you look at attacks against DNS. So from a volumetric standpoint, as well as from a billing model standpoint, if your DNS server charges based on the number of queries responded to, and you get hit with an attack, which we saw 2.1 million requests per second against DNS, guess what? If your DNS provider even stays online to respond to those, your bill is going to go through the roof. So there's a financial responsibility you guys have to look at that service model and how that can be abused. We see that all the time. It's called a leaky faucet attack. If you guys are using a content delivery provider, and I know that the hero image on your homepage is highly cacheable, I'm going to query that hero image. Just say it's 500K. I'm going to query that from 100,000 servers all day long for the next 2 months. And guess what? Your bill is going to go up because your CDN is going to do what it's meant to do, which is respond to that request. The last piece is event visibility. If you guys are pushing anything to the cloud, which I know a lot of you are, make sure you don't lose the control and visibility that you had and that you require. So if you can't see application layer requests, that's a problem. If you can't do more than just network blocking, that's a problem, right? And if you can't do correlation against what's happening at the edge with your cloud provider and what's happening on the backside, that's a problem. The FBI special agent was talking about kind of shifting attack vectors, right? So we see things like there's an IP address in Pakistan, just say. It's hitting you with a cross-site scripting attack for 3 hours. Then all of a sudden it stops, right? Did they stop because they went to sleep? Did they stop because they changed attack vector? If you could do correlation against that host that's attacking you and now see that your IPS shows that they targeted someone in marketing that looks young and helpful, and they clicked on a spear phishing email that had that same cross-site scripting code, now they're browser hooked to this same device. Doing correlation is going to help you track that attack path as it comes into your environment. All right, so that begs the question, how do you identify the difference between a good requester, a bad requester, and then an ugly requester? I didn't have Photoshop when I made this, so I just want to brag about something. Although I missed a little piece. I did this in PowerPoint where I had to put like a little angled shape, like a triangle, and then I had to move it, and so that's all cut out. Okay, no, so stupid. All right, so there's a difference between visibility and insight, right? If you're driving down the road and you see all these signs, you're like, all right, man, do not touch the sign. And then as you kind of approach the bridge, you realize, oh, guess what? I should have been paying more attention, right? This is what security professionals face all the time. Because as far as I know, raise your hand if your title is log reader dude or gal. Oh God, I'm sorry. Okay, so nobody has the title of log reader dude or gal, right? So you're effectively looking, excuse me, you're effectively looking at an indicator of compromise or at an attack after it already has caused an adverse effect on your environment, right? So the piece that we like to talk about is reputational scoring and tracking. Reputational tracking is the process of looking at requesters as they do good and bad activity across the internet. So you need a big data set to do this. And you look at what that activity represents. So instead of just saying this is a bad guy, because you guys probably have RBLs and blacklists that you download from other places, but reputational tracking will basically say, okay, based on your business, this is what the activity was that you might care about. So is it a DOS attacker? Is it an application attacker, right? Are they trying SQL injection, cross-site scripting, remote file inclusion, etc.? Or is it a scraper? Or is it a scanner? And then you have those categories, and then you say, from a score of 1 to 10, this is how bad it is. 10's the worst. So now, when you get that reputational score, and it's in a header value, so you can pass that back to your back-end log correlation or SIM tools, you can say, listen, scraping, I work for a travel and hospitality company. We have to allow a certain amount of scraping, right, for SEO purposes and for the kayaks of the world that do aggregation across multiple sites. That did not help at all. I really thought it would. That's kind of, I think it amplified it. So now you can say, based on my business model, this is what I care about, and this is what the risk score represents to me, right? And I'm going to choose whether or not to allow it or not. So the model that this represents is really taking your informational feeds. So if you guys are doing threat intelligence, you want to make sure that you're doing some kind of pre-sorting, validation of that traffic. You look at things like desktop agents that scan and they see what software you're using. There's actually a vendor outside that's doing this. It's really interesting. And basically it says, listen, based on the environmental, the things that you're actually using in your environment, here's the risk of those unpatched systems or whatnot, right? That's a piece of the puzzle that's totally different than just getting a feed from Microsoft and a feed from someone else for Windows updates, right? You're categorizing it. The other thing is you want this to be aggregated from reliable resources. So how much do you trust a blacklist site that says, actually, let's get a little survey here. Raise your hand if you've ever had an IP address that's been blacklisted by a third party that you trust, that you've had to go back and figure out a way to get it to be trusted again. Okay, all right. So if I raise hands, who's actually responsible for handling the inbound traffic within their environment from a security perspective? Okay, probably the same people raise their hands. All right. So we look at something like shell shock, right? On day one that this was reported, there was 53 unique attack payloads. A week later, there was over 124,000. I don't know why I'm about to cough again. This is getting... So the question is, how do you deal with large-scale vulnerabilities that you really have to be on the ball and patch them as they progress, right? We see these with... I actually got one. I need to be drinking it more often. Thank you. So when you look at creating a perimeter defense or a model where you can push the workload of blocking and validating requests off to the edge instead of at the front of your data center, you can now buy time for your operational teams to go through and do these types of fixes, right? So here's a few, and this is the part I like the most. Here's a few case studies of actual attacks we've seen and what they look like. So I talked about large-scale attacks against DNS. This was a multi-vector attack, so it's SYN and UDP floods against one of our gaming customers, actually, to the tune of 320 gigabits per second. So this is one of the largest ones we've seen. So, but I will tell you that the average DDoS attack size right now is 15 gigabits per second, which kind of blows my mind because you know, you look at kind of your average data center pipe that you're buying, that's pretty significant. 15 gigabits per second is going to cause disruption for anyone. Now what's interesting too is also a volumetric attack against DNS. You see the attacks, they ramp up extremely quickly. This is because the attackers are using amplification. So an old school DDoS attack means that a bunch of servers, I talked about the cloud-based DDoS attack, a bunch of servers are spinning up their connection scripts and they're saying open up a max thread of 10,000 requests, right? That has to ramp up. So you're going to start to see request traffic come in and it's going to slowly rise. Amplification attacks basically say, you know, I've looked at I've identified 100,000 NTP servers. I've put them into an AMP list. I'm using my C code or whatever it's written in Python to basically send out a request to those 100,000 devices. And all at once, and there's a little bit of variance based on network congestion, but all at once those devices respond back and they're sending those requests with a spoofed source IP address of your router, of your data center device, right? So that's why these attacks come in so quickly. So there's some on-prem solutions that basically have to take kind of a sample rate of like 10 minutes to validate against normal traffic, is this an actual attack, right? So we'll see the attackers launch attacks from a few 100,000 devices for 8 minutes. And then they'll stop and they'll take another few thousand servers and launch an attack from those for 8 minutes. That is a clear indication that the attackers can do some queries and identify what types of devices you're using. Or if your sysadmin is on a forum and says, hey, we just got these new great boxes, this is the model, blah, blah, blah. I'm kind of wondering what this option does. It's like, oh, that's great intelligence for an attacker to get, right? And if you think it's the perfect storm, you always look at data breaches. How did this happen? There's no way someone's going to do this, that, and then come in from here and then bypass this and go over there. That's exactly what happens, right? The threat intelligence portion of the attack, the information gathering, the reconnaissance portion of the attack is probably the single longest process of the attack process that the attackers do. Because they know if you aggregate all this low-risk informational findings, you can launch a more potent attack with that information. Now, when we look at that attack, the scary thing is that it was a 21-plus day attack campaign. So we talk about operational risk, right? If you guys don't have a 24/7 shop for someone to sit around and babysit an attack and to triage this, that's a risk to your organization. And the attacks basically were multi-vector, right? DDoS attacks against infrastructure IP addresses, DDoS attacks against the A record, the C name of the website, auth DNS requests, and this is measured in millions of packets per second, again, to overwhelm the DNS servers. And then reflection attacks, basically querying those servers and making them respond to illegitimate requests. So that represents a problem, and 8 of these attacks were over 100 gigabits per second. So that's scary, obviously. Here's something else that's interesting. So, so we helped stream the Olympics. That's one of the things that Akamai does, among others. And we wanted to look at what the real world consequences were of an actual event taking place versus what's happening in cyberspace. And we saw, I just said cyberspace, everybody drink. So we saw that during the opening ceremonies, attack traffic rose significantly, right? And then during the first day of sports, attack traffic rose significantly. In fact, if we look at how significant, 132 billion requests processed by the WAF during the Olympics, our WAF devices, and it was 10 times more than the Winter Olympics of 2010, right? So the attackers are ramping up their capabilities. Obviously, 166 million different custom rules triggered. That is massive, massive, right? Now we look at something else. Any soccer fans or football fans? All right, I had to say it with the accent. So we look at the FIFA World Cup, which we streamed, and we saw an interesting event. So this is during opening ceremonies, there was a game being played, Croatia versus Brazil. And if you look at the attack traffic, this is Croatia attacking Brazil because of the score that they had. Dead serious, right? In fact, if you look at most of the major games, you see attack traffic, and it doesn't, they don't care who's winning or not most of the time, but it's basically showing that real world events can correlate to cyber activity. When you look at the attack, application attacks specifically, not DDoS, application attacks in Q1 of 2015, obviously Q1 is, there's a lot of bleed over from the holidays, there's after Christmas sales, etc. So retail is getting hit pretty heavily. There's also a lot of advertising campaigns by retail companies after Christmas to do, to get rid of their past season's clothes, etc. Media and entertainment, hotel and travel, 2 big ones in this particular case. But we see these go back and forth depending on what time of the year it is. The attack activity will really vary. So what is the attack of the day? So right now, SNMP servers, you guys probably have heard a little bit about this. People are saying, get ready to drink. The Internet of Things. These are devices that, I can't believe, oh my God. These are devices that live on the internet that your ISP probably gave you, and they're listening with default settings for SNMP queries, right? Simple Network Management Protocol. Well, guess what? The default community string for read access is usually public. And guess what the default community string for write access is? It's private. So big surprise. So attackers can use amplification requests to query, the internet, identify based on, using Nmap, doing sequence number, OS sequence number prediction, etc. Identify what devices respond to SNMP queries, and then they use those devices to launch an attack at their victim. Charge-in. Does anybody remember how this was actually used in the old days? Because this service is really sitting out there, and it basically says, okay, print out all the different characters that you respond to and that you have capability of showing me. So this Python script basically queries a charge-in service, and it says, spit out this big text blob. And they do that because UDP is a connectionless protocol I've got a great joke about UDP actually, but I'm not sure you'd get it. All right, so stupid. All right, I had to say it. So UDP doesn't care, right? So they're sending a spoofed, and thank you for the pity, aha, because that helped everyone get going actually. So UDP doesn't care who the response goes back to. It's much more easy to spoof, obviously. So they're sending a request with a spoof source IP address of the target, of the victim, and then all these devices respond back with that large response type. NTP, we talked about this. This is the command, monlist. It basically says, tell me the past 500 devices that have queried time and synced time with this time server. That's a huge response, right? We've seen attacks over 100 gigabits per second using this method. And if you guys want to query your environment, here's a way to use the Nmap scripting engine to basically query any device, because remember, it's not just the NTP server that's on your network diagram that could be listening for responses. It could be any device. But Nmap scripting engine is really great. It really adds on to the extensibility of Nmap and what it can do. But this is going to give you a list of all the devices that listen for this command, right? And here's some troubleshooting info as well. So this is what the response looks like. Public clients, 597, and then it's a huge deluge of information, IP addresses and MAC addresses of these devices. All right, SSDP, part of Universal Plug and Pray protocol, and you see Chewbacca up here. I'm not sure what that picture is from, but I think it's pretty funny. So there's a scanning tool that if you guys go to GitHub and you look for AMP lists or you look for DDoS tools, you're going to see everything under the sun, right? It's usually Perl or Python or C code, and it's going to be basically the command to run these requests. And then what you do is you basically download an AMP list. And the AMP list is a list that someone else has found all of these devices that are vulnerable. You plug it into your script. So now when you type your script out, you plug in that AMP list, and it queries. Basically, this is looking for my desk port, IP destination. So right here, so these requests are going to come back typically at port 80 and 443. So if you guys see an uptick in port 80 and 443 traffic, there's the typical response is to say, wow, well, we're getting a lot of web traffic, right? But these aren't web requests, right? And we see SSL garbage attacks. We see SYN floods against web ports. It's because those web services are going to try to make sense of that request and basically fall over in the process. Let's see. All right, DNS attack, again, 19.1 billion requests over the course of this attack, right? From a financial services perspective, if you guys are responsible for how you engage with your vendors, that's a huge risk. And then we look at attackers sharing information, right? So I had, in another presentation, I had an IRC chat that we intercepted. And it basically is somebody saying, hey, how do I DDoS someone who's got DDoS mitigation? And the guy at first says, just DDoS harder, right? That's the obvious answer. And then he said, well, why don't you try DNS attack? I hear those are all the rage these days. So basically, the DoD got hit with this last year. And basically, someone faxed, because that's the best form of communication, to a registrar. They faxed in a request form to a registrar with the logo DoD on top, right, because that's not hard to find. And it says, hey, here's what we want to do. Our website no longer points to our real website. It points to a copy of the website that has compromised slogan on here, right? So this was a political agenda. You guys may be familiar with another large electronic car manufacturer. Got hit with the same thing. Defaced their website. Again, it's a copy of the website that's defaced. And because they can handle the inbound requests, because they have access to the registrar and the configuration for DNS, they went to Twitter and did a password reset request, and they control where the MX records live, so they took the inbound password reset email into their own email server that was listening, reset the password for Twitter, and started posting as them. Right, so we recommend registrar locks, client and server registrar locks, which is basically like an extended validation process for making any kind of DNS registrar change. So here's another government case. So this is a remote file inclusion, and basically you look at, we'll see a lot of WordPress blogs that are being targeted for this. This is Tim Thumb. This is a plugin on a WordPress blog. I mentioned before my grandma uses the internet. She's got like a cooking blog, I'm not kidding. But when her cloud provider gives her that server, all they're responsible for is, hey, I delivered WordPress, which is what you asked for, and I gave you a web server that's going to stay online, presumably. They don't care what version of WordPress you're using. In fact, if they upgrade it for you, it might break something. So they never do that. So there's hundreds of thousands of WordPress vulnerable blogs that have vulnerable plugins. Tim Thumb is a plugin that says, when I'm posting something, I want, you know, Tony Lauro's smiley mug to be next to my post, right? So it's an image uploader. So typically, you know, the PHP question mark, and then you'll have source equals. This is the query string parameter. And it will just say, okay, blogger.com. If you're looking at a truncated log file, all you see is blogger.com, and you think, oh, well, that's a valid URL. But if you look, it's actually blogger.com.springrollsnorthhills.com/click.php. So click.php, as it turns out, is a PHP script that's basically going to run as an eval statement. And guess what? If you're doing MIME type filtering, if you guys have next-gen firewalls that says, hey, when a request is made, look for the MIME type of image. Well, they open up an image file, a GIF image in a hex editor, and just copy the first line. And now when this is read by the web service parser, it's going to say, okay, this is an image file, so it meets the criteria. Well, if you look at what this script actually is doing, it's a complex clickjacking process that's taking the victim browser. Because of a vulnerability in your website, it's taking the victim browser and it's opening up either transparent iframes or just clicking through on the back end through an ad network that's generating Bitcoin money for Gollum and his friends, right? And we know Gollum, he can't be trusted. So this is actually a drug cartel picture, but that looks pretty awesome. I'll move on. So yeah, so the idea is not only can you be compromised, but you guys are paying money. Your marketing teams are paying money to get eyeballs at your website, right? So now they're taking advantage of those users to do something else for them on the back end. I talked about kind of scraping and the scraping process. This is a news article that came out just recently, but I wanted to tie it back to an actual customer that told me a story. And this story is, okay, so they're a parts manufacturer. They have, you know, millions and millions of part IDs, right? And they were basically getting scraped systematically from a bunch of different servers. If you answer with a 404, they'll change the request type. If you answer with service status 500, they'll change the request, they'll change the user agent, randomize everything. Until they realized that this scraping company was kind of a rogue reseller. So they kind of like this little symbiotic relationship, right? So this company in China would order parts from them, mark them up presumably or whatnot, and then resell them in that region. Well, after years of this relationship taking place, they now come to find out that they have scraped all their technical docs, they've scraped all the part IDs, and they've recreated their website with different branding to respond to customers within region, and essentially a copycat site, right? And this is nothing against the Chinese. A lot of countries are doing this. But if you look at the F-22 jet that the plans were stolen and all of a sudden it shows up on an airfield in China, they can steal a jet, they can steal your part IDs quite easily, right? Another attack type is SQL injection, right? So SQL injection is, you guys have probably seen this a ton. What I'll do is I'll query a web server, and there's an input form field that says, give me your name and some other information. And what I'll do is I'll send it SQL commands and then see what the error message is, right? So it's not like you just pop the database like that. It's not that simple, although sometimes it can be. But based on that error message, I know more information about how I'm going to attack the web server. So what we see is that developers and security folks are taking those error messages and suppressing those responses, or maybe giving like a graceful 404 or a graceful 200. Well, the attackers have found a way around that. So sending a blind SQL injection request using a time-based attack, the attackers can say, okay, if the first letter of the database name that I'm looking for is A, wait 10 seconds before you respond. If the first letter of the database I'm looking for is B, wait 15 seconds. And they can start to map information based on the time-based attacks. That's pretty scary. That's something that you need application level inspection, or else what's going to happen is your web server and your database server on the back end are just going to be queried over and over until they find what they want. So what does this look like from a big picture perspective? So over 1 week, these are the amounts of SQL injection attempts and categorization based on what types of attempts they were. So you'll see SQL injection probing. You'd be surprised this happens all day long, every day. One, you might be ordering RAM for your SQL server because you're like, man, the customers are really going crazy. That means we're selling stuff, right? No, absolutely not. You're being probed. And then the other attempts, the actual query that they requested or that they submitted was looking at credential theft and then more probing and recon. So the attackers will do a lot of reconnaissance again, layering on each request upon request, so they can take the aggregate of that information and have more idea of how to launch a more specialized attack. So here's one of the last, I've got a couple more slides here. This is command injection. Talked about shell shock. Basically in the referrer field, so we'll see attacks that are putting the request parameter into a part of the log, part of the request that only the log file server, if you guys have a SIM, will read. And then it basically, the attack is now into your network, and the log file server or log correlation server, its database gets attacked by the attack, right? So they're kind of layering it on. Normal requests, for regular web requests were very, very small. You see this request, whatever happened, it was validated and it got a huge chunk of information back, right? Typically what they're doing is they're doing a curl or a wget out to a remote file. Again, that's a PHP script that's going to run as an eval statement on the web server and is going to give you access to the web server. Last case here. So this is a request coming in. Again, Tim Thumb is being used, and the query string is picasa.com. Again, if you're looking at truncated log files, it looks like a valid image site, but it's flat above foodsberry.com/bad.php. So I asked myself, okay, this is coming from Istanbul, Turkey, and Foodsberry, flat above Foodsberry. It sounds like maybe an apartment or something. So I looked at the request, the bad.php, and again, big surprise, header value of an image, even has a authentication scheme. So we see where attackers will compromise like a few 100,000 servers, and then they complain on IRC a week later, hey, all my servers that I compromised got compromised by somebody else, right? So they're putting authentication methods into the process. Anyway, when this runs, I asked myself, okay, who's doing this? So I looked up Foodsberry. Turns out it's a cafe in Istanbul, Turkey, and above it are some apartments. And I said, could the attacker be dumb enough to launch an attack from, the answer is yes, exactly. So I looked at images that were geotagged for Foodsberry Cafe, and if you guys were doing takedowns and working with intelligence agencies, I'd be betting that this purple guy, he looks really creepy. I think that's the guy who's launching the attack. And then there's things when you're looking at application level requests that you'll never even see unless you have that inspection capability. So this is a request, it's a GET request, it's coming in, and then we see that there's this parameter here. The request was coming in, and I saw that the value was called credentials equals. And obviously when you show this in front of a bunch of hackers, you have to really obfuscate the base64 encoded value because I put this into a decoder. This was not using the secure only flag for the cookie, which means that the cookie was passed over HTTP. And I put this into a decoder, and look, it's email address : password. And just to let you know what this software is, it's a like a $30,000 a license AutoCAD software. Obviously, that's a big issue. The last piece on account checking, we'll see randomizing of user agents, a lot of different targeting of legacy APIs or old authentication mechanisms that you still have out there in your environment. And it's very easy. You go to NameCheck, this is a public site, you put in an email address for someone or a username, and it's going to check against all these different sites which services they're actually using. That seems pretty handy if you ask me. Also, the Carter and account checking tools, they have beautiful interfaces that have a green check mark every time they find a valid account. That's pretty handy. So the struggle is real. The problem with login abuse is that people are reusing credentials. I know none of you guys do it, but I'm sure that somebody out there, someone's grandmother is probably reusing credentials. So what we do against this is you're looking on the back end, looking for indicators of compromise for fraud, which are email address changes, address changes, one user having the same email address as another user, etc. The last attack vector, DD4BC, I talked about the X4 botnet. DD4BC is a group that DDoSes you for about 20 minutes or an hour, and then they send you an email, and the email introduces themselves. I love that they introduce themselves with an Akamai blog article, kind of ironic. And then it says, listen, we're going to DDoS you again unless you send me 200 Bitcoin. Right? And they list their Bitcoin address. And typically, even if you do respond and send them 200 Bitcoin, they'll DDoS you anyway. So don't respond to the bad guys. The attacks are coming from all over the world. I talked about a geographic response for this type of stuff. All right, so looking forward into 2015, all the verticals are basically able to be targeted. A lot of mapping and recon or looking for low-hanging fruits many times. But the attack sizes are enlarging because of the amplification and the different commoditized attack services that exist out there. And on the AppSec side, if you guys don't have an application security team, if you're not using BSIM to measure the effectiveness of your AppSec program, start doing that, right? Make a plan, set up a security advisory board that has one member from each critical piece of your organization, and they're responsible for security within their team, and you meet on a regular basis. That coordination is a big part of the puzzle to stop the problem of security being the roadblock. They typically want security to fix a plane in flight, but they won't let you get out of the plane while it's flying, right? That was a horrible analogy. The last takeaway is validated data, scale, and availability to provide resilience against attacks. If you guys are looking at cybersecurity, USCertandMiter.org has a cybersecurity resilience model that talks about how to do this kind of thing. A plan, if you don't have a plan for what to do if you're under attack or teams to resolve issues, you need to get that. And then control and flexibility. If you guys are using third-party providers, make sure you have that same visibility and control across those organizations. And then you need people to manage this, right? So what teams do you have involved that are dedicated to incident response or cybersecurity and resiliency or application security? Here's some resources, OWASP, BSIM, the SANS SWAT, secure coding practices, and then Akamai's website. That is about it. I hope you guys enjoyed it, and I'd like to see if there's any questions, because I've kind of monologued for an hour. Yes, sir. Can you show the last slide a little longer? Yeah. And we'll be sharing these slides through the ISSA site. Also, there's a website to take a survey. It's NTXISSA.org/survey. So if you guys could please fill out a survey, tell them that I offended you, that would be great. Any other questions? All right. Thank you very much, guys. Thank you.